I hate the fact that the last 2 years of GPU prices has made a $1,000 price point on the 7900 XTX feel like an aggressively priced good deal compared to its Nvidia counterpart. And don't get me wrong, in the current market and compared to Nvidia's flagship RTX 4090, and the price and the information we've seen about the RTX 4080 16GB, well, again, this feels like a good aggressive price, but I really want to make sure we all frame this in the reference to, well, 2 years ago, the RX 6900 XT was announced at $999, and it was ridiculed as an absolutely ridiculously overpriced waste of money compared to a slightly cut down version. 6800 XT would perform within about 10% and, deliver a lot of that same performance for under $700. And an RTX 3080 was supposed to cost about $700. And we all know what actually happened to the GPU market after that point. And quite frankly, the 6900 XT, at least now that things are getting a little bit more reasonable, has dipped significantly below that $1,000 price point where it initially launched at. But in other words, I want to make sure none of us lose sight of the fact that $1,000 for a graphics card is incredibly expensive, and there has been huge price creep here. However, if you also look at the amount of inflation that we've had over the last couple of years, well, technically this is actually a more aggressive price than we did see the 6900 XT. So, there's a lot going on here. Anyway, so overall, I think the $1,000 price point, maintaining that and not actually going past that, is actually good to see. And I don't mind expensive flagship GPUs as long as the price creep doesn't continue on up the stack. So while a 7900 XT at $900 is, when you compare it to Nvidia, probably going to offer some very interesting value. And I'm going to give my thoughts on the performance of these, based on the information we've been given in just a second here. I will say that I would have liked to see it $100 less, especially when we compare the specs. In other words, I think an $800 7900 XT would have been more interesting compared to, well, the 7900 XTX. Because, well, let's compare the specs here for a second. So let me fly, up into a corner or something. So the top-end chip has 96 compute units, 2.3 gigahertz game clock, 24 gigabytes, 384-bit GDDR6, 2.1 DisplayPort 2.1. I'll talk about this a little bit, but they made way too big of a deal out of the DisplayPort 2.1. AV1 encode and decode, and 350 watt total board power. And then when we compare it to the XT version, we're cut down to 84 instead of 96, 2 gigahertz game clock instead of 2.3, 20 gigabytes instead of 24. We still have the same DisplayPort and AV1 encoding, and we go down to 300 watts instead of 355. But the point is that percentage-wise, I feel like it seems like, given the specs, it's been cut down a larger percent than the price has been cut down between the two. So in the end, the market will dictate what these will sell for, not the MSRPs. The initial wave might just sell out regardless, but eventually prices correct to what the market will bear. And we're seeing that right now with the 6000 series and the 3000 series, and people are clearly willing to pay a premium for the Nvidia cards, that sort of a thing. And we've seen, for example, the 6900 XTs and the 6950 XTs come way down from their MSRP and fall closer in line to the 6800 XTs, although I still feel like there's too big of a gap there, and the 6800 XT offers better value. But I'm getting sidetracked. Let's talk about the newer generation here. So there's the specs, and AMD wanted to make a really big deal about things like DisplayPort 2.1 because they're trying to highlight places where they beat Nvidia. Because they clearly didn't show performance against the RTX 4090, and I think that's absolutely for a reason, but they did want to highlight places where they have a win with the DisplayPort 2.1. But again, while I would have loved to see the 4090 have 2.1, and I think people were right to criticize it for not having 2.0 or 2.1, because, I mean, on a $1,600 GPU, I think Nvidia obviously could have afforded to put that. It's a little bit more forward-looking. Realistically, the limitations of DisplayPort 1.4 versus 2.1 I think aren't really going to matter in realistic gaming situations, and it was really in poor taste for AMD to go on and on about 8K. Okay, also, the 4K frame rates you need to hit before DisplayPort 2.1 becomes necessary are pretty extreme and unrealistic use cases. I think AMD was absolutely right to show off the power draw and highlight that compared to the 4090, the overall size of the card, the fact that it uses 2 normal 8-pin power connectors. It is a very real concern for PC builders to be able to fit it in their case, not have to upgrade their power supply, all of that. So I think they were right to highlight those features. I think they spent way too long talking about DisplayPort 2.1 and 8K gaming. But anyway, let's talk about what I think most people actually really care about here, which is the performance and performance per dollar. Where does that stack up against the competition? So, okay, we see the 7900 XTX. They're claiming, again, let me make myself tiny out of the way here, up to, and again, we have to see the words up to, marketing speak, up to 1.7 times faster. And this is against the RX 6950 XT and at the 4K resolution. They did not give us a lot of performance numbers, but we do at least have this slide where we're seeing Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, 1.5 times the performance of a 6950 XT. Watch Dogs Legion, 1.5x. Cyberpunk 2077, 1.7. Resident Evil Village, this is with ray tracing enabled. Resident Evil Village has a very light ray tracing workload. So, in other words, this is important when talking about the ray tracing, especially when you compare it to Nvidia. Certain ray tracing workloads work a lot better on Nvidia than others do. So when you compare their performance relative to Nvidia GPUs, like I do a lot in my head-to-head comparisons, if I compare something like ray traced shadows, AMD is behind, but not by as much. But then when we compare something like ray traced reflections in Cyberpunk or something like that, they fall much further behind. So the specific ray tracing workload matters quite a bit when you look at their performance. It's not a simple ray tracing performance number in general. Anyway, Metro Exodus, which is again, we don't see the exact ray tracing settings they're using, by the way, either. But anyway, with ray tracing enabled, 1.5x. And Doom Eternal with ray tracing at 1.6. So here's the thing. First of all, we are not seeing the rumored, Greymon, was it Greymon? He was the leaker. Some people want me to do a video where I judge the leakers on their accuracy. We had seen a rumor of 2 times the performance, which I said I highly doubted, and I predicted it being somewhere between 50 to 70%, and I kind of guessed around 60%. Looks like I was pretty close. We were all hoping for a better performance increase in ray tracing, but it's looking like the ray tracing increase actually just lines up with the rasterized performance increase. And that's not really unexpected when you think about how AMD, I think, at least to my understanding, just computes the ray tracing on their shader cores. So as you get more of those and they're faster, they also get better at ray tracing, but not better at it in comparison to the uptick in just rasterized performance as well. So that's what we're seeing here. Now, we did also see these numbers. Now, these numbers feel less useful to me because I hate the fact that AMD was really free with the performance graphs that just say FSR on them, and they don't tell us the FSR settings. Now, we do still see it 6950 XT versus 7900 XTX, And we can at least assume that they'd have the courtesy of using the same FSR settings between these comparisons, whatever those happen to be. But we're seeing Cyberpunk 2077 with Ultra RT settings going from 42 FPS to 62 FPS on the 7900 XTX. And I would assume this has to be like the performance or ultra performance mode of FSR, because the Ultra RT settings at 4K are incredibly demanding, even for an RTX 4090, let alone a 6950 XT. So just throwing that out there. We got Dying Light 2 Stay Human, Ultra RT settings, again, 39 to 72, but I would assume this is, if they're just saying FSR, they're probably not wanting to admit that this is FSR performance mode. And Hitman 3 Ultra RT settings, we're seeing FSR 57, FSR 89. So there's definitely a performance gain in ray tracing here, but it's not the over 2 times performance increase that some people had leaked and some people were hoping to see. Now, what I think a lot of people want to know is, how does this stack up against the RTX 4090? And perhaps even more interestingly, how does it stack up against the RTX 4080? Now, let's take a look at the rasterized performance first. So what we really need to do is, since these comparisons weren't given versus the 4090, they were given versus the 6950 XT, we need to look at how does the 6950 XT compare against the 4090, and then also we need to understand that this is not, this is first-party marketing from AMD. Now, AMD's performance claims recently with their GPUs and CPUs, at least from what I've seen, have seemed to line up with reality pretty well, but that doesn't mean that they can't cherry pick some results. So always keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to use these numbers for some comparisons. Now, what is this? So over on our hardware, a while back, I found a really interesting post, which is a GeForce RTX 4090 meta review, which is a compilation of 17 launch reviews with a combined total of over 5,000 gaming benchmarks at all resolutions. And anyway, you can look into the details here, and I link all my sources in the description to my videos. But the point is, we can see how the 6950 XT performs relative to the 4090 as a percentile, with the 4090 set as 100%. So we can see here from like Cowcotland at 4K, and this is non-ray traced 63%. Other people are getting a lower percentage, but overall, out of all those reviews, it's averaging out to 57.1%. Okay? Now, how about ray tracing? We could also look at 1440p, 1080p, but the data we were given by AMD was at 4K, and the resolution does affect this, so we're going to stick to 4K. And ray tracing at 4K, the 6950 XT, and again, it's going to depend on the games tested, but overall, the average there was that the 6950 XT has 37.8% of the performance in these tests as the 4090. Now, it's very important to note right now that the games being tested and the scenes in those games being tested and the test platforms and all of that does not necessarily line up with exactly what was tested in this slide. So to be clear, what I'm doing right now is not completely precise, but it's all we have to go off of right now. But anyway, let's hop over to it's not a graphing calculator. Let's hop over to a calculator. So if you take a 100% performance baseline from the 4090 and you divide it by 57.1, you see that the RTX 4090 has a rasterized performance advantage of 1.75 times the performance of the 6950 XT in these average results here, okay? Now, a lot of people confuse percentages when you work them forward versus backwards. If something is 57% of the performance of something else, that does not mean, it's a 43% difference the other way. It's not 1.43 the other way, okay? So you divide it like this. So in other words, I would have to multiply the 6950 XT's performance by 1.75 to get back to the performance of the baseline, which was the RTX 4090. And when we do this for ray tracing performance, when we divide 100 by 37.8, we get 2.65. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is based on this data set, which is an average data set from a whole bunch of reviews. So based on that data set, in order for the 7900 XTX to catch up to the performance of the RTX 4090, it would have needed a 1.75 times performance to its rasterization and a 2.65 performance uplift to its 4K ray tracing. Okay? Now, like I said, none of this is perfect. This might not be exactly what we see in every single review and every single game. This is some napkin math. But now let's look at what we're seeing. So we're seeing a 1.5 to 1.7 times uplift, so maybe we could call 1.6 pretty reasonable. So in other words, we are not seeing a performance uplift that would indicate it will compete with the RTX 4090 on average. It looks like on average, it will be slower. That doesn't mean there won't be particular games and particular graphics engines and things like that where maybe it will be on par or even faster. But we would have needed to see a 1.75 uplift on average, and we're not seeing that. We're seeing up to 1.7, and up to is usually talking about best case scenario, okay? And then in ray tracing performance, it's also looking like about 1.5 to 1.6, and well, like we said, we would have needed like 2.65 to catch up to the 4090. Now, no reasonable person should have thought AMD would catch up to the 4090 in ray tracing performance, so I don't think this is surprising, but I think it is a bit less than what some of us wanted to see, okay? But anyway, the RTX 4090 costs $1,600 if you manage to catch it at its MSRP, which was hard to do even on launch day. I got one of the cheaper models on launch day for $1,700 myself, and ever since then, they've been sold out unless you wanted to spend well over $2,000. So, getting this close in rasterization, it looks like it's getting pretty close. That offers a pretty good value if you don't care much about ray tracing. However, when you're spending $1,000 on a GPU, you might be wanting the best of the best. So what's really going to be interesting, I think, is its comparison against the RTX 4080 16GB, which is coming in at a $1,200 MSRP, and obviously some models will come out way ahead of that. And by the way, the charts I'm picking out now are ones from Nvidia themselves, and this is back before they unlaunched the 4080 12GB. Now notice the 4080 12GB, in a lot of tests, was on par or slower than a 3090 Ti. Okay, in Nvidia's own claims. By the way, you might be looking at the big green bars over here. That's DLSS frame generation, which is kind of cheating, right? And what you should be looking at is the gray bars here. I've talked about this in another video. The gray bars here are DLSS off. So if you want to see DLSS off performance numbers from Nvidia themselves, look at these gray bars. Anyway, so I think now we might be seeing why Nvidia, other than just the negative reaction from the press and the public and everything, might have thought a 4080 12GB at $900, needed to be unlaunched because, well, if we're seeing the 7900 XT coming in at that same price, and it's not going to make these performance numbers, but it's not cut down a whole lot. Okay, right? I think that would have been a bit of a joke. So anyway, but the 4080 16GB coming in at $1,200, so that's asking for a $200 or 20% premium over the XTX 7900. Well, I mean, where does that put us compared to the like a 3090 Ti, which in rasterization performance is fairly close to a 6950 XT? Well, I think we're going to stack up pretty favorably in rasterized performance. But, in ray traced performance, I'm not sure we're going to see as good. That's just going to be a question that we're going to have to see. We don't actually have performance numbers here. I'm showing you the slides I have. Again, look at the gray bars if you want to see DLSS off, how the 4080 16 gigabyte stacks up against a 3090, 3090 Ti, but again, and against a 4090. But again, this one's with ray tracing on, all of that, but it's hard to say exactly what we'll get. So anyway, now speaking of DLSS 3, okay, AMD did announce a FSR 3. Okay, now they did not tell us much about it at all, but the fact that they're calling it motion flow makes it sound like what DLSS frame generation is, which is some kind of, frame interpolation where it's not really generating new actual performant game frames. It's probably some kind of, it doubles performance by averaging 2 frames and probably has some sort of latency penalty. And they say it's not coming out until next year. And I honestly have to wonder if AMD's actually been working on this a long time, or if this is some kind of a, we got blindsided by DLSS 3, let's start working on this now, say it's coming out next year, and now we can at least announce feature parity, and let's hope our engineers can deliver. I'm a little bit worried here, guys, to be honest. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with that. There was a few other things we saw in this announcement. One thing that I think is, when I'm reading people comment about it, I think a lot of people are misunderstanding it or didn't watch the actual video, but AMD's Hyper RX. This is not a new thing. It's just turning on several buttons you've already had by pushing one button. They were very clear in the video that this is basically just saying, in games that support features like AMD's anti-lag technology and RSR or Radeon Boost, things like that. A lot of people don't use those because you might not even know what they are. They're buried in your driver software. There's so many of them. It sounds to me like what AMD's Hyper RX is just a branding for a single toggle that will just enable all of the AMD features that the game already kind of supports. So that's all that is. Now, they did say that they could see up to 85% better performance with 1/3 of the latency by clicking that button. But again, I don't think this is really, it's really just to make it easier to do something that you could already do. Now, I am excited about the AV1 encode decode, and they did announce partnership with OBS. Now, OBS, if you're not familiar, is what many people use for their live streaming setup, and it's actually what I'm recording this video on right now. It's really powerful software, and it sounds like AMD is taking that more seriously and should be getting deeper partnerships to getting good AV1 encode and decode support. I think that's fantastic because, again, one of the feature advantages NVIDIA has had traditionally is better for live streaming because their NVENC encoder looks better at lower bit rates, but AV1 should hopefully solve that problem. The main thing we need to wait for that to actually solve AMD's problem is the live streaming services themselves need to actually accept the AV1 signal. So to my knowledge, the big ones like Twitch have not yet updated to do that. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I don't think it's actually officially supported yet by Twitch or anything like that. So something we need to just keep our eyes on and see how it goes. So again, overall, like I said, this is a very good aggressive price against the 4090. And I hate calling it that. I really hate calling $1,000 an aggressive price. But it is a lot less than $1,600. Anyway, I don't think it's going to be as good as a 4090. The performance numbers they gave don't make it seem like it'll be as good, and they did not give any direct comparison, which again makes it not seem as good. I was hoping, honestly, I get why they don't want to, in their own marketing video, show it losing to a 4090. But if they had showed that, some graphs where it's just a little bit behind and then immediately switched to a graph that was performance per dollar, then I think, they could have swung it that way, right? I kind of wish they had done that and given us some direct head-to-head comparisons They're not going to be able to hide that fact once reviews come out. So I'm hoping we do get some direct head-to-head comparisons against the 4090. And again, I think that that's fine if they just mark it on performance per dollar. Maybe what they're waiting for, I think what AMD might be waiting for is for the 4080 to release. Because once the 4080 releases, they might feel like they can now mark it as a performance win against the 4080 at a lower price, and maybe they're waiting for that before they give the direct comparisons against the competitors. So anyway, it's possible I've forgotten to say something in this video. It's really late, guys. I was at parent-teacher conferences all day. Luckily, this AMD live stream happened during my lunch break, and I was able to watch it. But I was at work till like 8:30, came home, had to get my kids to bed and do the dishes and eat dinner, and now, anyway, it's really late. So hopefully all of this made sense, and I'm sure I will be doing some follow-up videos as more details emerge or I have more things to say. I hope all of you have an excellent day, and please let me know what you think about all this in the comment section.